Lesson 6, Behavioural Economics and Economic Policy, and how behavioural economics influences economic policy. The first thing on the board behind me is a thing called framing. Now, framing is a bit like when you go and join a big company like Virgin. You sort of know what it's about already. Virgin is very innovative, it's very lively, it challenges the status quo, it comes up with new ideas. It's got fantastic customer services, it breaks some of the old business models. Now when you go and join Virgin, so therefore you sort of know what it's about, so you sort of know how you should react to that particular company. Football clubs, sports teams use it all of the time. So Liverpool have the Shankly way. So it's a certain way of playing football. So it's attacking minded football, it's football on the ground, and it's quick movement of the ball and passing. And that's the way in which they play. So when you go and join a club like that, you know that you ought to have strong technical ability, because that's the way that you're going to play. Whereas if you go and play for Leicester City, it tends to be, because they haven't got as much money, it tends to be more brute force, strong, good strong centre backs, lots of balls in the box and knock it in the back of the net type of thing. Okay, so different cultures. Right, but framing sort of sets the whole scene which individuals work. It's a bit, to be honest, it's a bit like social norms again, that particular one. Now, how does behavioural economics influence economic policy? Well, traditionally economic policy is all about the individual, who is rational and selfish, and therefore by pursuing their own self-interest they will create wealth, so therefore everyone else will gain, and that's the basis of free market economics, and that's what we've always worked with. Okay, but we're now working with behavioural economics has come into this and says, well, there are different features of the ways in which people works, and people don't always make rational decisions. So in this case we have institutions can construct sets of options which sort of pushes people into making the right sort of choice. So if you go and work for Virgin, then you are meant to be slightly risk-taking and great customer service, so it pushes you into maybe those sorts of directions. Right, but we're particularly really interested in public health policy. Now then, the argument is that we should nudge people into the right direction so that people make the right choices about their health, and therefore they're going to save the National Health Service a lot of money, right? Okay. There's a big difference between choice architecture and stating by law that you should do this. So we could have a law that says you should not eat processed food. We could have a law that says you should have less salt in your food. Or we could have a law that says food manufacturers, will you put the right sort of food in the right sort of products, so therefore people don't get diabetes. Could do that. Now, to give you a classic example of sort of nudging, the word that they use is nudging. Take the example of bicycles. Bicycles are obviously good for you. They save on carbon emissions and they make you fitter. So we could have public hire schemes around. So you go to London, you can go out there, or you go to Paris, you can go and you can hire a bicycle and then you drop it off at a certain point. Now that nudges you towards using bicycles. Or they may introduce cycle lanes. And if there's cycle lanes, then more people will probably go by bicycle. Or you can subsidise bikes. As a teacher now, I can buy a £1,000 bike for 750 quid. So I'm more likely to go and buy a bike, so therefore I don't go buy a car, and it nudges me in the right sort of direction. So we're using this rather than telling people what to do, because economists or neoclassical free market, people who believe in the rational man, would support the argument that the law respect the public's health ought to be constructed in a manner which does not constrain the liberty of citizens. So what that means is we should not construct laws which say this is what citizens should do, right? Because we're taking away the liberty of individuals. What choice architecture does, it provides the right sort of environment so that hopefully people would make the right sort of choices in terms of their health. And here we're talking about behavioural economics and changes in economic policy, and we've just spoken about framing and choice architecture, and right now I'm just going to talk about nudges and what that means, and giving people a nudge and seeing what happens from there. So a nudge is an aspect of choice architecture that alters people's behaviour in a predictable way without forbidding any options. Okay. So what nudging does, it really gives a third way between laissez-faire economics, right? People can make their own choices, people are rational, just leave it up to the free market, no problems. And the alternative to that is a top-down command and control technique, which says if you do this, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And I'm just trying to think of an economy that uses that, the top-down control technique, and that'd be something like Singapore. If you go and vandalise a car in Singapore, it's a very, very serious offence, and you can be given a year or even 2 years in prison. So therefore nobody ever vandalises cars. So they have a very strict policy on those sorts of things. Now actually Singapore is also a very happy society, so maybe those rules are actually quite good. We're not really talking about that here. We're talking more about nudging people in the right direction, but allowing them to actually make the choice. And as I was preparing this talk, I was trying to think, well, what sort of nudges are there? And okay, I've given you loads of examples because I'm a keen cyclist about cycling. The more people who cycle, therefore it provides a nudge to everyone else. Everyone else thinks, well, actually cycling is a really good way of getting fit, particularly when you get older. It doesn't hurt your knees and anything else. So therefore we want to nudge people towards cycling. And there are subsidies for cycling, as we previously discussed. Maybe another one would be, if you turn up to A&E drunk, then you should pay a fine, or you should give something because they got to look after you, and then that may nudge you in the right sort of direction about not getting drunk and then injuring yourself in the process. Giving adverts out about smoking and say actually smoking gives you lung cancer, which is obviously really, really serious, but maybe it just gives you really bad breath. And actually that's going to affect teenagers much more. The fact that if your breath smells, so therefore if you snog someone, it's not going to taste very nice. That's reason not to smoke. And I've just recently thought, well, as I've now reached 50, then I'd go for a health check, and they sit there on the computer and they say, well, Mr. Charlie, you've got a, that's not my surname, by the way. Well, Mr. Charlie, you've got a certain % chance of getting a stroke, unless you lose a little bit of weight. So hopefully then I will change my behaviour, and therefore I'm less likely to get a stroke, and therefore less likely to cost the health service a lot of money. Okay, so it's called libertarian paternalism. And I've just been reading an article about it, and he said, well, that's a bit of an oxymoronic term, right? But a libertarian paternalism, which means paternalism means that you don't want to tell people what to do, but you want to look after them. Okay, so it's liberty, but you're sort of being a bit of a father figure to them as well. That's the idea of the state. I think this is pretty relevant, because in the UK 61% of people are either overweight or obese, which is pretty serious in terms of type 2 diabetes. 21% of people smoke. That costs the health service a combined total of almost £20 billion a year. So there are lots of good economic reasons about why we should do it. And actually the whole thing about nudging is that it is cost effective. So it actually is going to save the government money. So you're sort of telling people what they should do with their lives, but actually it's going to save the National Health Service money, and it's going to increase productivity and everything else. A nudge is not like with a seatbelt. By law, you have to put a seatbelt on, otherwise you're going to be fined. So that is an actual law and an actual regulation. Should people have free choice over seatbelts? Most people would say, well, it should be a law, because it's crazy not to wear a seatbelt. Okay, nudging. So what we've done so far, we've done choice architecture, nudging, and framing. Been looking at bounded rationality and bounded self-control, which means to say that people do not always possess self-control and people are not always rational. We then looked at the way in which behavioural economics could adapt to economic policy, and it's now becoming pretty popular within the UK, partly because it's more cost effective and everything else, but you're trying to nudge people in the right directions, you're trying to give people the right sort of choices, so therefore they will make the right decisions because people need help in making the right choice. Now this is called libertarian paternalism, and is sort of the third way between the laissez-faire economics, individuals know exactly what they're doing, and an autocratic state or a command and control from above which says this is what you're going to do. Right, so this is the last part of that, and this is default choices, restricted choice, and a mandated choice. Okay, so it's still giving you a choice in each of these, but it sort of pushes you in the right sort of direction. Now, a default choice is where they sort of put the choice down and they give you the one that they wanted to do, and if you don't make a choice, then that's the one that you will in fact be doing. So for example, if you had like in Sweden where they sent out a list and you could choose from 450 funds, right, and what they found, it was too many and people couldn't really work it out. People didn't really know what fund was where. It did get people talking about funds because they thought, well, perhaps I should put my money here or there. However, it was too much choice. And in fact, the option that did best was the safest option, which was just an index linked option to the Swedish stock market. So what they then did on the next time round, they gave that as the default option, right? And then they had a medium risk one. I'm making that up now, so I don't know, but they gave them two other options, maybe a medium risk one and a high risk one. So if you felt that you want to go high risk and you go high risk and medium risk, you would go medium risk. However, by giving that as a default option, that was by far the most popular choice. Whereas previously they hadn't given a single default option. People had to make a choice out of 645 fund managers' options. Because actually most people haven't got enough time to go through all the different ones, and they don't understand it that well anyway. Or another one was you could have a workplace pension, but in this one, if you didn't send the forms back, you opted into the pension, and you had to fill out the forms if you wanted to opt out. Now that made a huge change in how many people did have a workplace pension, because they didn't have to fill out a form. So therefore they didn't bother, so therefore they all opted into the pension. And the idea there is, of course, it's much better to be in a pension to save for the future rather than not to save for the future. Right, so that's a default choice. You can have a restricted choice, which I've already covered, which is where if you have too many choices, you're probably going to make it becomes too confusing. You haven't got enough time to make all those different choices. I mean, I find, I'm not going to bash Tesco's here, but I don't like shopping at Tesco's for the simple reason, when I look at the biscuit stand, it goes on for about 30 odd metres. I don't know what sort of biscuits I want. I just want a nice simple choice, and it gives me a headache deciding on what sort of biscuits I want. Yeah? Normally I just like cheddar cheeses, and that's what I want to see. I just want to see cheddar cheeses in my local co-op. You just get cheddar cheeses and chocolate whatever. Okay? So I go for cheddar cheeses. Tesco's, there's too much choice and it gives me a big headache at the end of it. And lastly, you can have a mandated choice where you're still given the freedom to choose what you want to do, but you have to make a choice. So particularly if we apply this to organ donation, obviously people want, the NHS wants people to donate more organs, so you have a choice. You can either opt in or opt out, but you have to make a choice. Because if people don't make a choice, then they can't bother to fill out the form. Where if they opt in and opt out, I think, well, perhaps I really ought to opt in because it's generous to give an organ. So by mandating choice, you still got the choice, but you have to make a choice. Okay?